Assalamu alaikum. So welcome to our session on bone marrow failures in HemeCon 21 under Pakistan Society of Hematology. We have got a galaxy of stars here in the form of esteemed speakers and panelists. I'll just introduce my panelists first. So our first panelist is Brigadier Asad Mahmood Abbasi. He's a professor of pathology and head of hematology in Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Our second esteemed panelist is Hilal Imtiaz, military Major General retired Tariq Mahmood Sati. He's currently working in Shifa International Hospital as a senior consultant physician, clinical hematology and bone marrow transplant. Our third esteemed panelist is Brigadier Syed Kamran Mahmood. He's a senior physician, bone marrow transplant physician and clinical consultant hematologist at Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center. Our first speaker is Dr. Sobia Umar. She's a second-year resident in clinical hematology at Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center, and she'll be talking about response of immunosuppressive therapy in patients of aplastic anemia, real-world experience from a developing country. So over to you, Dr. Sobia Umar.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank PSH for inviting me to this platform. My name is Dr. Sobia Umar. I'm resident clinical hematology at AFPMTC. And today the topic of my presentation is response of immunosuppressive therapy in patients of acquired aplastic anemia. Real world experience from developing country. I've got no conflict of interest. Acquired aplastic anemia is a rare bone marrow failure syndrome characterized by pancytopenia with a hypocellular marrow in absence of an abnormal infiltrate and with no increase in reticulin. Allogenic stem cell transplant offers curative treatment. However, a number of patients cannot undergo hematopoietic stem cell transplant either due to lack of suitable donor or because they are unfit to receive transplant. Immunosuppressive therapy can lead to hematological improvement in aplastic anemia. The objective of my study was to determine the response of IST in patients of acquired aplastic anemia. This is a retrospective single-center study conducted at AFPMTC, and the duration was between January 2002 to December 2019. Inclusion criteria included cases of acquired aplastic anemia who received IST for at least 12 weeks, both genders and all age groups. Exclusion criteria included patients not completing 12 weeks of IST either due to death or side effects or non-compliance. Cases included in final analysis were 511. The treatment regimens that we've looked at is cyclosporin alone, cyclosporins with androgens, cyclosporin with ALG, and cyclosporin with Rebit ATG. Out of 511 patients, 371 were male, that is 72.5%, 140 patients were female, that is 27.5%. Median age was 23 years, and the age range was between 2 to 97 years. Median baseline laboratory parameters, median hemoglobin for our population was 7.6 grams per deciliter, median retics was 0.2%, median absolute neutrophil count was 0.5 into 10 raised to power 9 per liter, and median platelet was 9 into 10 raised to power 9 per liter. Now, if we look at the severity distribution, 116 patients had non-severe aplastic anemia, 278 had severe aplastic anemia, and 117 patients had very severe aplastic anemia. If we look at response to treatments, out of 511, 155 patients responded, that is 30.2%. Out of which CR was achieved by 12.3% and PR was achieved by 17.9%. 57.9% patients did not respond to treatment. If we look at the response outcomes according to disease severity, the best response was seen in non-severe aplastic anemia group with 50.4%. There is a significant association between response outcomes and disease severity with p-value of less than 0.001. Now, if we look at response outcomes according to treatment modality, 355 patients received CSA alone. The best overall response was seen in non-severe aplastic anemia group of 52.6%. Now, if we look at CSA and androgen arm, 54 patients received this treatment, and overall response was equal between non-severe and severe aplastic anemia group of 18.1%. Now, patients who received CSA with ATG, overall response rate was best among non-severe aplastic anemia group of 50%. CSA and ALG group, overall response rate was 100% in non-severe aplastic anemia group. Now, if we look at response outcomes according to age in patients who were less than 40, the best overall response was seen in patients receiving CSA and ALG of 63.6%, and in patients who were more than 40 years of age, the best overall response was seen in patients receiving CSA alone of 32.7%. Now, if we look at this slide, this gives us the overall survival of patients receiving IST. Overall survival was 38% at median follow-up of 36 months. Now, if we look at this slide, this shows the survival according to the age. There is no a significant association between the overall survival and the different age groups, p-value 0.288. This slide shows survival according to treatment modality. There is a significant association between overall survival and the treatment modality with p-value of 0.016. Percentage of patients surviving in CSA alone group was 45%, with CSA and androgen was 33%, CSA with ATG or ALG was 36%. Median survival time with CSA alone was 60 months, with CSA and androgens was 9 months, with CSA plus ATG or ALG was 39 months. Now look, if we look at this slide, this shows the survival according to disease severity. Again, there is a significant association between the overall survival and disease severity with p-value of 0.001. Survival at the end of the study in non-severe aplastic anemia group was 62%, with severe aplastic anemia group was 43%, and very severe aplastic anemia group was 18%. Median survival time for non-severe aplastic anemia group was not reported, as more than 50% survived at the end of the study, and severe aplastic anemia group was 47 months, and with very severe aplastic anemia group was 10 months. Now, if we look at the international data, Marsh conducted a study in 2012 which showed the response rate at 6 months for Rabbit ATG was 40% and overall survival with Rabbit ATG was 68%. Chen conducted a study in 2013 which showed response rate at 6 months with Rabbit ATG of 45% and overall survival of 83%. Jeong in 2014 showed that the response rate at 6 months with Rabbit ATG was 55% and overall survival with Rabbit ATG was 87%. In our study, the overall response rate was 50% with CSA and Rabbit ATG. I would like to conclude by saying that in my study, there is a significant association between disease severity and overall response rate and overall survival. There is a statistically significant association between treatment modality used and overall survival. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Sobia Umar, for an excellent presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Fayaz Hussain. He's a third-year clinical hematology resident at Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center, and he'll be talking about a novel TBI-free conditioning protocol for haploidentical transplant in acquired aplastic anemia. So Dr. Fayaz Hussain, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Dr. Fayaz, resident clinical hematology at Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center, and I will be talking about a novel TBI-free conditioning protocol for haploidentical transplant in patients with acquired aplastic anemia. So when it comes to aplastic anemia of any, when it comes to severe or very severe aplastic anemia, the only definitive treatment option for younger patients is usually allogenic stem cell transplant. Because of suboptimal response to immunosuppressive therapy, a significant risk of relapse, and a non-negligible risk of transformation, lifetime risk of transformation to MDS or myeloid neoplasms. For allogenic transplant, however, a full matched family donor is usually available in 30% of the cases. And having no donor registries and no cord blood facilities in Pakistan means that for our patients, haploidentical transplant is usually the only other alternative. The introduction of post-transplant cyclophosphamide-based conditioning regimens with its attendant lower risk of GVHD has made it an attractive option. However, most of the conditioning regimens for haploidentical transplant with post-transplant cyclophosphamide usually use TBI-based conditioning. The objective of this study was to evaluate the outcome of a TBI-free conditioning regimen in haploidentical transplants in patients with severe and very severe acquired aplastic anemia. This is a prospective trial done at Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center. Enrollment started in July 2018 and is expected to continue till June 2021. The data I am presenting today is till December 2019. We included patients of severe and very severe aplastic anemia aged 2 to 60 years with a reasonably good performance status. Patients with donor-specific antibodies are having inherited bone marrow failure syndromes or severe sepsis at the time of transplant were excluded. This left us with a total number of 10 patients for the final analysis. The conditioning regimen consists of busulfan in addition to fludarabine, low-dose pre-transplant cyclophosphamide along with rabbit ATG, followed by infusion of GCSF primed bone marrow or peripheral blood collected stem cells on day 0 and day +1 if required. The GVHD prophylaxis in addition to post-transplant cyclophosphamide on day +3 and day +5 showed cyclosporin as well as MMF. The primary outcome measured was overall survival, while consideration was also given to graft failure, treatment-related mortality, disease-free survival, GVHD-free relapse-free survival, and acute and chronic GVHD incidence. Coming to the results. Both the genders were equally represented in our study population. The median age of the participants was 15.5 years, with the eldest being 41 years and the youngest 5 years age. The median duration from diagnosis to transplant was 14 months. All the patients, majority of the patients had a significant previous transfusion history, and the median donor age was 23 years. All the recipients and the donors had evidence of serologic exposure to CMV. The median CD34 dose was 8 × 10⁻⁶ per kg. The stem cell source for 7 out of 10 patients was a combination of bone marrow harvested and peripheral blood collected stem cells. ABO mismatch of some degree was present in 6 out of 10 patients. 7 out of 10 patients engrafted. 1 patient had primary graft failure, another patient had secondary graft failure due to CMV, while another patient had a poor graft function at day at 2 months post-transplant. Subsequently, she received a stem cell boost 2 months post-transplant and is enjoying stable counts now. Acute GVHD was reported in 1 out of the 10 patients, which was of stage 2 skin GVHD, which responded to oral prednisolone. 8 out of 10 patients had experienced CMV reactivation following transplant. At a median follow-up of 13 months, the overall survival was 80%, as was the disease-free and GVHD-free relapse-free survival. The 2 patients who died after transplant, one was a female 20 years old who had primary graft failure and succumbed to sepsis on day +31. Another patient, also a young female, died of intracranial hemorrhage on day +44, and she had secondary graft failure due to CMV. This is the list of all the patients. So when we compare our data to international studies, all the transplant protocols who use TBI and post-transplant cyclophosphamide have shown good engraftment percentage along with a reasonably low level of incidence of GVHD. The results of our study having almost similar number of patients as comparable. While studies who use busulfan-based conditioning without post-transplant cyclophosphamide had significantly increased risk of GVHD. To conclude, our study shows that for countries lacking TBI, the use of busulfan-based protocol along with post-transplant cyclophosphamide is feasible and is associated with lower rates of acute and chronic GVHD. And with that, I conclude, and I thank you all, and I thank PSH for providing me this opportunity to present this data.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fayazan, again for an excellent presentation. Our next talk is from Dr. Humayun Shafiq Sadfi. He is a PhD in molecular genetics and assistant professor in NUMS University. He'll be talking about mutational landscaping of autosomal recessive osteopetrosis in Pakistan. So over to Dr. Humayun Shafiq Sadfi.
Thank you very much. I'll be presenting our recent project titled Mutational Landscaping of Autosomal Recessive Osteopetrosis in Pakistan. Osteopetrosis is a group of rare single gene disease characterized by sclerosis of skeleton. There's a defective osteoclast function in osteopetrosis, which results in overgrowth of bones, which makes them thick, dense, and sclerotic. At least 11 forms of osteopetrosis have been known so far, with different modes of inheritance and a degree of severity which cumulatively has an incidence of more than 1 in every 100,000 live births. Autosomal recessive osteopetrosis, also known as infantile malignant osteopetrosis, has an incidence of 1 in every 250 live births. However, this incidence may be higher in some populations due to an increased degree of consanguinity, some tribal customs, or presence of a founder mutational effect. Unless treated in certain cases with hematopoietic stem cell transplant, autosomal recessive osteopetrosis is usually fatal within the first decade of life. The mode of inheritance in this case is obviously autosomal recessive. Presentation of osteopetrosis. The patients commonly present in hematology OPD with impaired hematopoiesis, with symptoms of anemia, thrombocytopenia, and infections. There is a cranial nerve compression leading to blindness in many of the patients, also some hearing loss. Other symptoms include hepatosplenomegaly, frequent fractures, or dental crowding on X-rays. These patients generally fail to thrive and present with macrocephaly. The diagnosis is primarily made on skeletal survey. Bone marrow aspirate with trephine biopsy is carried out to assess the hematopoiesis status in bone marrow. Lymph node biopsy is carried out in patients having lymphadenopathies. Some neurological and ophthalmic reviews are also required to conclude the diagnosis, whereas the gold standard still remains genetic tests. There are a few competing differential diagnoses which one has to consider while making a diagnosis of autosomal recessive osteopetrosis. The pathophysiology of autosomal recessive osteopetrosis. Osteoclast formation requires the presence of RANKL, receptor activator of nuclear factor kappa B ligand, and macrophage colony stimulating factor. These membrane-bound proteins are produced by neighboring stromal cells and osteoblasts. A genetic defect in these proteins results in a lack of differentiation of osteoclast into mature and active form, and the resulting form is osteoclast poor osteopetrosis, as is shown in the left side of the figure. While in other cases of osteopetrosis, there's a genetic defect in the machinery involved in proper functioning of osteoclasts, like the TCIRG1 gene, which forms the alpha 3 subunit of bacular type ATPase enzyme in the proton pump, or CLCN7, which is a chloride voltage gated channel, forming a chloride voltage gated channel in osteoclasts. The list of genes known to be involved in autosomal recessive osteopetrosis. The overarching objectives of our study were to identify genetic variants involved in osteopetrosis among Pakistani population and to establish a genetic facility for this disease, which will provide a mutational screening for most frequently mutated genes in our population. The expected outcomes we laid down for ourselves were to provide a mutational landscape of ARO in Pakistan, and then design an in-house gene panel for our patient population, and to facilitate a rational therapeutic decision making. We also aim in future to provide career counseling and fetal screening through networking with our list of consultants. Patients suffering from ARO were ascertained based on radiological and laboratory evidence. Their pedigrees were made and biological specimens collected after obtaining informed consent. In the phase 1 of our research, we performed whole exome sequencing. DNA samples were collected from 8 families with at least one affected child, and these samples were sent to our collaborating lab in China for whole exome sequencing, whereas the bioinformatics part was carried out at NUMS. The variants, therefore, prioritized were further verified to Sanger sequencing. And in these 8 families, the most predominantly mutated gene was TCIRG1, followed by CLCN7 and OSTM1. Nearly all of these genes were involved in clinical phenotype. 5 of these mutations were found in exonic region, while 2 were in splice site mutations. For phase 2, we aim to devise a protocol for screening of TCIRG1 and CLCN7, which are otherwise established in the existing literature as most predominantly mutated genes. We are establishing a genetic screening panel at both at AFBMTC and IBGE at KRL. These will be used for screening of hematopoietic stem cell candidates and their appropriate donors, as well as to carry out carrier screening for fetuses at risk. Many osteopetrosis patients do not respond well to BMT for various reasons. Genetic screening can help in determining the chances of a successful outcome of BMT. Moreover, a reference mutational database is also essential for each country for genetic studies and screening of patients and carriers. In about 10% of patients worldwide, there is still no gene discovered for osteopetrosis. And at NUMS, we have also recently established a functional genomics lab where we'll be taking these patients, the sample for these patients where no genetic known gene is involved. We'll try to find new genes, and we'll try to decipher function for these new genes in animal models, zebrafish and mouse models in future. A few acknowledgements which are essential to be made. I am indebted to Colonel Tariq Ghafoor for his support in getting the patients, and Dr. Sugra Wahid from KRL, and Judge Suhaib from Genetic Resource Center, and Professor Feng from China, a collaborator. A few other colleagues of mine who had worked on this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Humayun Shafiq Sethi. for interesting and informative talk. So our next distinguished speaker is Hilal Imtiaz Military Major General retired Parvez. He's president of Pakistan Society of Hematology, and he's one of the pioneers of clinical hematology and bone marrow transplantation here in Pakistan. Currently, he's the director of bone marrow transplant unit at Quaid-e-Azam International Hospital, Islamabad. So over to General Parvez.
Thank you, Dr. Usman. My talk will be basically focused for the diagnosis of bone marrow failure syndrome, and I'll be specifically talking about the acquired aplastic anemia. Since I've been associated with aplastic anemia over the last 2 decades on various aspects, starting from epidemiology to the bone marrow transplant, I'll give some certain practical points. I'll be highlighting that for its diagnosis. Now, this is the classification of bone marrow failure syndrome. It consists of idiopathic aplastic anemia, PNH, MDS, and within the aplasia we have got the acquired and constitutional, and I'll be mainly dealing with the acquired aplastic anemia. Now, as we know, that there is an overlap of syndromes of bone marrow failure, and even aplastic anemia has got some overlap with the MDS, especially hypoplastic MDS. Then there is overlap with PNH and other inherited bone marrow failure syndromes, and of course they can transform, all of these can transform into MDS and acute myeloid leukemia. This is the spectrum that correlates the normal hematopoiesis with various bone marrow failure syndromes. In the lymphopoiesis, we have got the primary immunodeficiency. Then for myelopiesis, we have got severe congenital neutropenia, then pure red cell aplasia for the erythroid series, and congenital amegakaryocytic thrombocytopenia for megakaryopoiesis. And inherited bone marrow failure syndrome would cover all the aspects of this hematopoiesis. Even MDS and severe aplasia would also cover all the aspects of the hematopoiesis. Most common presenting, of course, is the cytopenias. It could be single lineage or pancytopenia. This is the the definition of pancytopenia for the purpose of bone marrow failure: hemoglobin concentration less than 10, absolute reticulocyte count of less than 40, and absolute neutrophil count of less than 1.5, and platelet count less than 100. They are taken as the standard for defining pancytopenia. Now, a few words about the normal bone marrow cellularity. Say, for example, in a patient who is 35 years of age, this would be hypocellular marrow, this would be normocellular, while on the extreme right we'll be having hypercellular bone marrow. General formula is 100 minus H would be the estimated normal cellularity. In most of the families that have got even the non-inherited, otherwise acquired aplastic anemia, I have noticed the cellularity is a bit lower than this formula. Now, conditions associated with the low marrow cellularity are the acquired aplastic anemia, inherited bone marrow failure syndrome, hypoplastic MDS, hypocellular acute leukemia, and GVHD. The other conditions, of course, they have got obviously the other associated signs, but the upper 4 or 5 conditions that we need to have some differential diagnosis. The common causes in our setup are the infections, drug-induced pancytopenia, inherited and acquired aplasia, MDS, and acute leukemia. Now, coming to approach for diagnosis, the most important one is the history, followed by clinical examination, then CBC and examination of peripheral blood film, bone marrow aspiration, good length and good quality refined biopsy are the mainstay of diagnosis. Of course, certain specific investigations would be required for diagnosis of specific disorders. Demographically, the aplasia we see in younger median age group in our setup in this part of the world, there is a bit higher proportion of male patients presenting with aplasia. Higher proportion of inherited bone marrow failure syndrome as a result of consanguinity is seen in this part of the world. In these situations, there is usually family history of aplasia in siblings or in other close relatives. There is a higher prevalence of hepatitis B and C virus infection. Drug-induced aplasia is also not uncommon due to use of various non-traditional medicines. And we don't have any significant genomic testing facilities in this country. Now, there are certain clues in the history to find out the cause of aplasia. For autoimmune disorders, vegan diet, GI surgery and celiac disease, the likely cause could be B12 deficiency, poor diet in green vegetables and allele section would point towards the folate deficiency. Acute history presenting with bleeding, infection and pallor, aplasia is common. If there is lymphadenopathy or type B symptom, underlying lymphoproliferative disorders are the likely diagnosis. If there is weight loss, massive splenomegaly, we have got the myelofibrosis or hairy cell leukemia as cause of aplasia. And we would have symptoms of autoimmune disorders like polyarthralgia, photosensitivity, morning stiffness. And of course, there would be history of pregnancy in case of postpartum aplasia. In MDS, there is a prolonged history preceding the symptoms. The history is relatively short in severe aplastic anemia. Family history would point towards the inherited bone marrow failure syndrome. History of jaundice, we can think of post-hepatitis aplastic anemia. If there is exposure to radiotherapy or chemotherapy, there could be transient aplasia or there could be myelodysplasia or acute myeloid leukemia. Now, a patient with pancytopenia would usually have pallor, bruising, or infection, signs of infection. If there is lymphadenopathy or visceromegaly, the likely causes are not the idiopathic aplastic anemia. In classical aplastic anemia, there is no lymphadenopathy or visceromegaly, and the only signs would be the pallor or bruising or petechiae. The other condition that would fall into this would be the megaloblastic anemia, MDS, and transient aplasia due to drugs or toxins. In general physical examination, nail dystrophy or other symptoms of inherited bone marrow failure syndrome will be obvious, and we can have various signs of autoimmune disorders. In abdominal examination, the signs of hepatitis could be there. Lymphadenopathy or hepatosplenomegaly would point the diagnosis other than idiopathic aplastic anemia. Now, coming to the specific clinical examination of eye can point out thrombocytopenia if there are retinal hemorrhages, or leukemic infiltrates can be seen on fundoscopy. On oral examination, we can see the oral petechiae or hemorrhages in thrombocytopenia, stomatitis or ileitis can be sign of the B12 deficiency. In leukemias, we usually find gingival hyperplasia that is typically absent in marrow-aplasia, idiopathic marrow-aplasia. Then oral candidiasis can be complication of the neutropenia, whether due to the infection or due to underlying malignancy. For all cases, we require examination of peripheral blood film and bone marrow aspiration and good length defined biopsy. A CBC and examination of peripheral blood film by hematologists are essential. A standard battery of additional tests may include the serum LFTs, the hepatitis serology, blood coagulation profile, Coombs test direct and indirect, and in selected cases serum B12 and folate testing, and in suspected HIV infection, HIV testing would be required. In the peripheral blood film, there is usually a mild to moderate degree of macrocytosis. This is typically seen in aplastic anemia, and even majority of the cases of bone marrow failure syndrome would have some degree of macrocytosis. There is typically reticulocytopenia unless there is underlying PNH. The neutrophil count is low, as well as the morphology is of typical normal granulation. Lymphocyte count is absolute count is low, generally low, but there is relative lymphocytosis on the bone marrow peripheral blood film. Platelet count is low with normal morphology, and there are no abnormal morphological abnormalities on the peripheral blood film. These are the various abnormalities that you would see in MDS or acute leukemia. Almost always bone marrow examination is required in cases of pancytopenia once we are investigated, except for certain selected cases of B12 and folate deficiency or some chronic liver diseases. The differential diagnosis of pancytopenia may broadly be classified based on bone marrow cellularity. Reduced cellularity indicates decreased production of the blood cells, while normal or increased cellularity indicates ineffective production or increased destruction of the cells. In bone marrow, hypocellular fragments with depressed trilineage hematopoiesis is seen in aplasia. There would be pockets of cellularity with widespread hypocellularity. This is seen classically in evolving aplastic anemia, or even full-blown aplasia would be having certain pockets of normal cellularity. Hypocellular bone marrow with dysplasia is seen in hypoplastic MDS, whereas hypocellular bone marrow with collection of blast in certain areas is seen in hypoplastic acute leukemia. In MDS, bone marrow is typically hypercellular with classical dysplasia, and the most intense hyperplasia, especially the erythroid hyperplasia in bone marrow, is seen in megaloblastic anemia. Rest, of course, the findings are typically seen depending upon the underlying cause. Now, in marrow aspirate, you would see scanty cells with some plasma cells. Now, this is a defined biopsy. Most of the residual cells, they are either plasma cells or mature looking small lymphoid cells with scanty hemopoietic tissues. Now, this should not be confused with any plasma cell dyscrasia or disorder. This is seen in some cases of aplastic anemia. You would find certain areas would be having the plasma cells and lymphoid cells, but if we see the overall cellularity, that would be decreased. So this should not be confused with the plasma cell disorders. This is the extreme hypocellular bone marrow seen typically in severe aplasia. Now, this is the marrow aspirate showing trilineage dysplasia. This would be seen in myelodysplastic syndrome. But in certain cases of non-severe aplasia, the marrow cellularity is moderately hypocellular, and there are certain pockets that if we hit on aspirate, we may find this sort of picture. Though this is not the aplasia, but if we ignore the dysplasia of the non-erythroid, there is mild to moderate degree of dysplasia in erythroid series with mild megaloblastic changes. If we hit a hot pocket, they are not unusual to find in marrow aspirate, and this should not be confused or mislabeled as megaloblastic anemia. The catch is that in megaloblastic anemia you would find the indents hyperplasia, and hypoplasia, even if in any small portion of the defined biopsy, you see it would go with non-severe aplastic anemia rather than megaloblastic anemia. Then there are certain specific investigations that would be required in the patients who have got certain disorders associated with pancytopenia like MDS and PNH. This is the flare in which the CD66 and CD16 is more sensitive, especially in aplastic anemia with a small percentage. If there is small clone of PNH, that would be missed by typical red cell CD55 and 59 analysis. This is the diagnostic algorithm that we have proposed for patients to diagnose and presenting with pancytopenia. In the history, if there is insidious onset, fatigue, shortness of breath, gum bleed and fever, and there is no family history of short stature, dysmorphic features, low blood counts, normal siblings, and the physical examination is unremarkable other than the petechiae and pallor, we would go for the CBC. In the CBC, we would be having low hemoglobin, MCV is moderately high, low white cell and platelets, blood film only shows macrocytosis, normal neutrophils, relative lymphocytosis and no abnormal cells. We are probably dealing with idiopathic aplastic anemia. In case there is family history of anemia and short stature, we are dysmorphic features. There is family history of MDS or acute leukemia, we should consider inherited bone marrow failure syndrome, and on dysmorphic feature on the physical examination would also point towards the inherited bone marrow failure syndrome. Bone marrow aspirate, if it is hypocellular, depressed erythropoiesis, myelopiesis and megakaryopoiesis, there are mature lymphocyte and plasma cells that are relatively prominent. There are no abnormal cells. We would go for bone marrow biopsy that is of normal architecture and hypocellular. The diagnosis and is acquired aplastic anemia, and we would classify according to the severity. If there is absent stainable iron, we should think of the PNH, and if there are prominent blasts, we would think of hypoplastic acute leukemia. Similarly, dysplasia, if more than minimal or the architecture is abnormal, we would investigate for hypoplastic MDS. Any infiltration by atypical cells, we should rule out the possibility of LGL. So coming to the conclusion, pancytopenia is a commonly encountered problem with broad differential diagnosis, and a systematic approach should be adopted to identify underlying etiology. history, physical findings combined with marrow aspirate and good quality bone marrow biopsy is the most important step in diagnosis of bone marrow failure. And I thank you with this.
Thank you, General Pervez. Thank you. Thanks a lot for giving us some pearls of wisdom and practical approach in the context of bone marrow failure syndrome. Our next speaker is Dr. Tariq Kafoor. He is head of Department of Peds Bone Marrow Transplants in Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center. And the next talk is about update on the management and diagnosis of inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. So to Dr. Tariq Kafoor, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this talk on PSH platform. I would be speaking about inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. So inherited bone marrow failure syndrome are caused by the inherited germline mutation occurring in the hematopoietic stem cells compartment or the other hematopoietic stem cell and progenitor cells, resulting in specific diseases such as Fanconi anemia, dyskeratosis congenita, Schwann-Diamond syndrome, Diamond-Blackman anemia, congenital amegakaryocytic thrombocytopenia, and neutropenia such as Coats-Man disease, as well as familial telomerase diseases. So inherited bone marrow syndromes are characterized by uni or multilineage cytopenias and increased risk of developing MDS, AML, or a solid tumor. They can be diagnosed in childhood and adult with a projected cumulative median survival age of 16 to 72 years. And unlike immune-mediated bone marrow failure syndromes, inherited bone marrow failure syndromes are non-responsive to immunosuppressive therapies. And this transplant remains the only curative treatment option for inherited bone marrow failure. So this is a long list of workup, including the clinical history, which dating back to birth history of skin or nail findings, history of leukoplakia, anomalies of eyes and ears, history of malabsorption, GIT symptoms, frequent infections, pulmonary symptoms, cardiac symptoms. And the clinical examination, the diseases have typical facial features. There are certain skeletal abnormalities, skin pigmentary changes, and then a family history, because these are the usually inherited disorders. So there can be other siblings having the similar diseases. And the laboratory tests, including the complete blood with differential reticulocyte count, bone marrow aspiration and biopsy, cytogenetic studies, and the liver chemistries, Coombs tests, and flow cytometry for CD55, 59 for PNH, chromosome breakage analysis, and telomere length studies, adenosine deaminase levels, and HLA typing. Now I would be going through some common disease. The Fanconi anemia is the most common inherited bone marrow failure syndrome. It was described by Dr. Fanconi in 1927 when he described 3 brothers with macrocytosis, pancytopenia, and physical abnormalities. And towards the right is a picture of which I saw in my clinic a few years ago when the 2 elder siblings, they were brought for the transplant, but unfortunately the other 2, they all had Fanconi anemia. So it's a familial inherited disorder. It's an autosomal recessive and rarely X-linked recessive inherited disorder. Incidence is in 1 in 3 per million with a carrier frequency of 1 in 300. It is characterized by a variety of congenital abnormalities, bone marrow failure syndrome, and predisposition to malignancies with age such as MDS, AML, and squamous cell carcinomas of head and neck. And cells from patients with Fanconi anemia exhibit spontaneous chromosomal instability and characteristic hypersensitivity to DNA interstrands cross-linkages agents such as deoxybutane and mitomycin, which are the basis for the diagnosis of Fanconi anemia. So Fanconi anemia is basically caused germ-like mutation in the DNA repair genes. 20 genes have been described so far, which are involved in the process known as the Fanconi anemia pathway. Fanconi anemia pathway is activated when DNA replication is blocked due to DNA damage. The Fanconi anemia pathway sends certain proteins to the area of damage, which trigger DNA repair, so DNA replication can continue. And Fanconi anemia pathway is particularly responsive to certain type of DNA damage known as interstrand cross linkages. This is a figure just described. On the left is the normal cells, which have where the Fanconi anemia pathway ensures correct DNA repair by homologous recombination, whereas the error-prone alternate pathways using non-homologous end-join are rarely used. But in Fanconi anemia patients, the error-free DNA repair by homologous recombination is impaired, so the alternate DNA repair pathways are used most commonly, leading to genomic instability and cell death. The patient usually have progressive bone marrow failure. Thrombocytopenia and macrocytosis are often preceded by the anemia, and elevated hemoglobin F and elevated expression of I antigen on red cells are also seen. Patients have increased serum alpha protein levels, and erythropoietin levels are usually elevated in anemic Fanconi anemia patients. Median age of presentation is 7 years, but we have seen as young as 2 years of age. So the question, why does the bone marrow fail in Fanconi anemia, still has an unclear answer. Bone marrow failure seems to occur because of progressive decline of CD34 cells in the bone marrow compartment, probably starting in the uterus. And these unresolved DNA damage is needed for initiation of bone marrow failure. So these are the pictures showing the chromosomal breakage. The Fanconi anemia is diagnosed by presence of elevated chromosome breakage in lymphocytes after exposure to DNA cross-linking agents such as deoxybutane or mitomycin. In about 10 to 30% of Fanconi anemia patients, this test may be inconclusive due to somatic mosaicism, which occurs when there are two populations of lymphocytes in the patient's blood. Soon after diagnosis, patient need to be allocated a monitoring plan, and then depending upon the severity of the bone marrow, if the patient has normal marrow or mild marrow failure, we will see the blood counts. If the blood counts are stable, then bone marrow clonal abnormality or significant dysplasia will be looked for. And if it is patient has some dysplasia, so we will continue monitoring blood counts 1 to 2 months and marrow every about 3 months. And the patient does not have significant dysplasia, then we will continue with the blood count monitoring on 3 to 4 monthly basis and marrow on yearly basis. And if the patient does not have a stable blood count, then we will do the marrow every about 3 to 4 months. And then comes the bone marrow failure, mild, moderate, and in the case of moderate marrow failure, patient should be work up for the transplant. Meanwhile, we're waiting for the transplant, we can go through with the different therapeutic options such as androgens. I will come to that later. And severe marrow failure, they are the unrelated donor transplant, or we can give a try of androgen, but usually they are not going to last for a long time. And MDS or AML transplant preceded with chemotherapy, or sometime we don't give even the chemotherapy and they can be transplanted treated with the transplant only. So generally there are three major areas of support. Is the hematological support with the transfusion, androgen, and allogenic transplant. So synthetic androgen have been used for over 50 years. And the most pronounced is the effect is in the red blood cells and platelets, but neutrophil count may also improve. Mechanism to raise peripheral blood count and bone marrow cellularity in patient are unclear. They do not prevent progression to AML, and they should be considered when HB is less than 8 and platelet are less than 30. Oxymetholone is probably the most commonly used androgen, and if no response is seen within 3 to 4 months, then we can stop this medicine. About 50% of patients improve with the median prolongation of life by about 2 years, but relapses are inevitable. And there are associated toxicities such as virilization and hepatic adenoma and carcinomas. And the patient should, these patients, because they do not respond to an ATG or the cyclosporin, they should not be given any trial of immunosuppressive therapy. And the transplant remains the only curative treatment for bone marrow failure, though it does not cure the non-hematologic complications such as sarcomas. Patients with a proven diagnosis of Fanconi anemia who has a marriage sibling donor are all potential candidates for transplant. And indication and timings are the patient, when depending upon the patient hematological status, patient age, and overall clinical condition, and then the transplant experience center. Experience of the transplant center and the decision of the family. So absolute indication, the severe aplastic anemia and transfusion dependency. Number 2 is the high risk MDS, refractory anemia with high risk of chromosomal abnormalities, and the AML. And the best outcome with the transplant is seen in the patient younger than 10 years of age, CMV negative, no or few blood product exposure, treated with fludarabine in the conditioning regimen. I will be coming to the conditioning in the next few slides. So donor selection is basically marriage sibling donor is the best donor. If it is not available, then phenotypically matched family donors. We have done few transplant with the mother, and then unrelated donor and the cord blood transplant, which is not available in Pakistan. We are not doing any transplant with the cord. And then haploidentical transplant. So preparatory regimen, the earliest attempts in transplant with Fanconi anemia patients in the 1970s and 80s, they used the same preparatory regimen designed for patients with idiopathic severe aplastic anemia, which consists of cyclophosphamide 50 milligram per meter square, per kg for 4 days. But that resulted in very high mortality and morbidity. Then Gluckman and his colleagues, they did the marked, they studied that marked attenuation conditioning regimen for Fanconi anemia, demonstrated that transplant could be safely performed with low dose cyclophosphamide with long-term survival in 75% of the cases. And the following these results, 4 patients with Fanconi anemia were conditioned with low-dose cyclophosphamide, that's 20 milligram per kg, in combination with radiotherapy, and all of them engrafted. Then the addition of ATG to the Gluckman regimen was the next important milestone in transplant of the Fanconi anemia patients. This addition further improved the outcome by decreasing the incidence of both acute and chronic GVHD. And then Farzin et al. Reported 10 years accurate survival of 89% with a significant decrease of acute and chronic GVHD in 35 patients undergoing marriage sibling donor transplant using peritransplant ATG in combination with low dose of cyclophosphamide and radiation. Then introduction of fludarabine was the next important milestone in the transplant of Fanconi anemia. The reported rates with fludarabine containing preparatory regimen range from 38 to 96%. In a large retrospective study of 98 alternate donor transplant for Fanconi anemia and IBMTR, they have reported an incidence of engraftment and improvement in engraftment and overall survival from 52 to 52% compared with the non-fludarabine regimen where the overall survival was only 13%. This is a figure that with the fludarabine, this overall survival is 52% and the non-flu base is 13%. So I will be talking about a few words about the transplant, what we have done at AFBMTC, and for about 10 years, 11 years time, we have done 28 Fanconi anemia transplant. There were 20 male and 8 females, and mean age of diagnosis was 7.67 years diagnosis, and mean age of transplant was about 10 years. and 13 patients were less than 10 years, and 15 patients were more than 10 years of age. 19 have no mismatch, BU mismatch, and sex mismatch was recorded in 18 patients. We used a conditioning mainly was the flu 120, Psi 30 and ATG 20 in 24 patients, and only 4 patients which were in the earlier time, they had flu 150, and GVHD prophylaxis was done with cyclosporin. Stem cell dose was the main source for the bone marrow, and the TNC was 5 with the CD34 about 7. Neutrophil engraftment, the mean age day of engraftment was 11 and platelet was 20. So major complications were neutropenic fever, mucositis, hypertension, hemorrhagic cystitis. 1 patient has veno-occlusive disease. 20% patients have the acute GVHD, and almost similar number had chronic GVHD. And overall survival of the and disease-free survival is 75% of all cohort. And the major cause of mortality was primary graft failure in 3 patients, GVHD in 2, and pneumocystic CMV pneumonia in 1, and pulmonary hemorrhage in 1. And what we see is we are currently using the flu 120 where the survival is 83%. Then coming to next disease is disc keratosis congenita, is a clinical triad of abnormal skin pigmentation, nail dystrophy, and mucosal leukoplakia. The classical clinical course is mucocutaneous features in childhood, followed by the bone marrow failure in adolescents, or usually by the age of 20, and they die in the young adulthood. And genetically heterogeneous, characterized by very short germline telomeres, resulting in chromosome abnormality due to telomerase deficiency. And there is increased risk of MDS about 30% and AML in 10%, and solid tumors in about 20 to 30% cases. So basically telomeres are the complex protein structure at the ends of chromosome which protect the chromosome ends from degradation, and telomerase is an enzyme which is responsible to maintain the length of telomeres by addition of guanine-rich repetitive sequences. The somatic cells usually lack this telomerase, but the germ cells, some stem cells, and most cancer cells, they have the telomerase. And excessive telomerase shortening and dysfunctional telomeres play a central role in the pathogenesis of disc keratosis congenita. Though usually present patient with pancytopenia by the age of 50 years, by the age of 40 years, more than 95% they develop pancytopenia, and overall cumulative incidence of bone marrow failure is approximately 50%. Often the degree of aplasia in the bone marrow is striking despite only a moderate degree of peripheral blood cytopenias. And hemorrhage or opportunistic infections are the major cause of death. In patients with atypical disc keratosis congenita, bone marrow failure may appear before the classical mucocutaneous features and lead to an initial diagnosis of idiopathic aplastic anemia. And hypoplastic dysplastic MDS and MDS AML, they can also be seen in these patients. They can be also associated with the combined immunodeficiency. So what we see is on the laboratory finding is in the peripheral blood, the patient have cytopenias, thrombocytopenia, neutropenia, or pancytopenia, and low number of circulating progenitor cells. On the bone marrow, we will see the hypocellular marrow affecting all 3 lineages. They can have disc erythropoiesis, hypocellular, MDS, or even AML. So this slide basically shows the defect. There are different defects leading to deficiency of telomeres shortening, and then the associated features. All patient disc keratosis congenita and hematological manifestation, they require the full hematological assessment, and bone marrow and anticipation of possible transplant, HLA matching should be done. And the treatment of bone marrow failure in patient with classic disc keratosis congenita is similar to that is patient with Fanconi anemia. Anabolic steroids, oxymethylone, may be 2/3 of the patient their response, or the growth factors such as the GCSF may be tried, which give a transient response. ATG and cyclosporin, they are also ineffective in disc keratosis congenita, and transplant remains the only treatment option. However, the outcome have been poor due to early and late complications in disc keratosis congenita. Then Shwachman-Diamond syndrome is another very important inherited bone marrow failure syndrome. It is also it has a triad of pancreatic insufficiency, bone marrow failure, and skeletal abnormalities. Hematological abnormalities for the diagnosis, at least one of them is required to make a diagnosis, such as neutropenia, anemia, thrombocytopenia, and persistent elevation of hemoglobin F, persistent red cell microcytosis. And then one of the endocrine, exocrine pancreatic insufficiency is also required to make a diagnosis. And additional supportive evidence for Shwachman-Diamond is the bone abnormalities, behavior problems, presence of first-degree relatives with the same disease. Treatment is the symptomatic pancreatic enzyme replacement, then infection prophylaxis, GCSF can be tried, and the likelihood of survival correlates with the degree of bone marrow failure. And transplant is the only curative treatment for bone marrow dysfunction associated with Shwachman-Diamond. However, the timing of transplant remains a subject of controversy. Transplant is the, like Fanconi anemia patients, children with Shwachman-Diamond tend to have increased toxicity with intensive conditioning regimen. So extreme sensitivity to cyclophosphamide is also seen in these patients. So they should be getting a reduced intensity preparatory regimen that might ameliorate cardiac and pulmonary toxicities. And the myeloablative conditioning with matched sibling donor overall survival is about 60%. Deaths mainly relate to MDS, leukemia, organ toxicity, especially cardiac toxicity, neurogenic and pulmonary toxicity. Higher rates of TRM in the patients receiving TBI has been reported. And reduced intensity conditioning with Kempath, fludarabine, melphalan. There are this is study reported in 2008, 100% engraftment, overall survival is 100%. And the conclusion is the higher mortality in patient transplanted with active dysplasia or malignancy, and high rate of toxicity with cyclophosphamide or TBI containing regimens. New success with RIC with high rates of engraftment and overall survival. Then Diamond-Blackfan anemia is another inherited disorder. It is secondary to ribosomal protein genetic defects, usually present within the first year of age, and it is associated with congenital abnormality and increased risk of cancer. 1/3 of patients with congenital abnormalities such as short stature, abnormalities involving head, upper limb, heart, and genitourinary system. Diagnosis is based on peripheral blood and bone marrow findings, increased adenosine deaminase in RBCs, and genetic testing. The long list of the anomalies which you usually see in the Diamond-Blackfan anemia, starting from head and then to the upper limbs, and then renal, genitourinary, cardiopulmonary, eyes, and neck. So corticosteroids remain the mainstay of treatment. We have few patients in our hospital which responded well to the corticosteroids, and they are about 37%. They have long-term response to steroids. Then the other option is the chronic blood transfusions, depending upon the requirement, maybe every monthly basis or 6 weekly basis, and the transplant remains the only curative treatment for the hematological problems. So indication are the steroid intolerance, transfusion dependency. A study conducted by the EBMT group is probably the largest study with the studies 106 patients from 1985 to 216, including 60 male and 46 females, and with a mean age of 6.8 years. Underwent transplant with the matched sibling donor was almost 57%, match unrelated 36%, and they used bone marrow in majority, about 70% patient, and PBSC in 20% patient. So 86% patient received a MAT with including busulfan in 66 cases, and 86% of them engrafted by day 28. Median days to neutrophil and platelet engraftment was 18 and 36 days respectively. Event-free survival and overall survival at 36 months was 81% and 84%. And overall survival at less than 10 years of age children, they have better overall survival. There were no difference were noted between transplant from sibling versus unrelated transplant. And day 100 acute GVHD and 36-month chronic GVHD was 30% and 15% respectively. A higher, not statistically significant incidence of extensive GVHD was noted in these patients with the unrelated transplant. Higher baseline risk for malignancy than the general population is also seen in Diamond-Blackfan anemias such as AML and sarcomas. Number of transfusions before transplant significantly correlate with the time to neutrophil and platelet engraftment. With a less than 50 transfusion, higher rate of engraftment of neutrophil by day 28 and platelet by day 60. But it does not have any effect on the survival. They concluded the study with the transplant largely limited to the transfusion-dependent patient with matched sibling donor, increasingly feasible to use match unrelated donors, and it is important to limit transfusion exposure, minimize steroids side effects, and monitor for malignancy. Late transplant-related effects can be seen in almost every organ, such as the cardiac, pulmonary, renal. The fertility dysfunction is the most common. Restrictive or obstructive pulmonary disease in about 24% of patients. Aseptic necrosis, severe osteoporosis is also seen in these patients. And then secondary malignancy, especially in bone marrow failure syndrome with already increased risk of malignancies such as Fanconi anemia, dyskeratosis congenita, and Schwarzman-Diamond syndrome, involving exposure to high dose of cyclophosphamide or radiation, which may be associated with the GVHD as well. So our experience is, because these are very rare disorders, we have done 6 transplants in which all of them were matched sibling donors at BMT in the last 10 years. There were 2 male and 4 female, and mean age of transplant was 2 years. We conditioned with busulfan and cyclophosphamide 200, thymoglobulin 7.5, and there was no TRM, and overall survival and disease-free survival is 100%. This is just the picture, and that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tariq. Thanks for a very informative talk. So we are ahead of time for a couple of minutes. So before our next speaker, we have got some time for questions. So I'll start a question from one of the guests from Karachi. So Dr. Irfan Ahmed has asked from Liaquat National Hospital to Dr. Tariq Ghafoor. And the question is, what common inherited bone marrow failure syndromes you see, and does consanguineous marriage, which is a close relative marriage, promote inherited bone marrow failure syndromes birth? What's your experience in that, sir?
Oh, it's a very difficult question to answer, because sometimes when you are going, though the children are the main aim, but first you need to find a partner, and if they have the cousin marriages and other. It's a very debatable question, we don't know. Probably the antenatal diagnosis can be the option, because sometimes even the families, they know that this, we usually see in the thalassemia that the family, they know that both of they are the carrier, but still they go for the marriage.
True.
So I don't know what to answer about this question.
Yeah, it's complex socially and socially as well. Certainly, that is true. That is true. So, other question is to Dr. Major General Parvez Ahmed, and the question is again from Karachi, and that is around B12 deficiency in pancytopenia. So, General Parvez, your experience of B12 deficiency in pancytopenia, how often you see, as it is a quite reversible cause in Pakistan?
You mean the how frequently do we encounter the B12 deficiency?
Yes.
That was the question?
Yes, that is the question.
It's not that unusual to find low B12 as a cause of pancytopenia, especially in the hospital practice. And once we are dealing with the geriatrics and old patients, the frail patients, they have got poor diet intake, and keep on finding the low B12 levels as one of the important causes of pancytopenia. Though, in the younger population and in the general population, it's not frequent. But in the hospital settings, it is one of the causes that must be considered, that should be kept in mind.
Okay, and just another question actually is coming in my mind is that as far as the cause of secondary aplastic anemias or causes of secondary aplastic anemias are concerned, which ones are the commonest ones in Pakistan? Like, do you consider that Hep C or hepatitis based or related secondary aplastic anemias are more commoner, or what's your kind of experience in that?
We had collected data in close to 2,000 aplasia patients, and it's difficult to find out the association with hepatitis, specifically whether it is hepatitis A or B or C. Though there were, I don't exactly remember the number of cases that followed following the history of hepatitis. Of course, there were certain cases, but the association with a particular type of virus is not established, and it's not very common to find aplasia following hepatitis, because hepatitis C is very common in this part of the world, but rather in this country, the carrier rate is very high. But the aplasia associated with the hepatitis C or B is not common. Rather, hepatitis C resulting from the blood component transfusion is quite frequent among the aplasia patients.
So you still think that idiopathic aplastic anemia is the most commonest one still in Pakistan?
Yes,
is that right?
there are certain families. For example, as an index case, I'll quote just family. One female, she is in her mid-30s, and her brother had aplastic anemia and got bone marrow transplant at our center in 2012, and his disease is still in remission. And his elder sister, she developed aplasia last year, and we transplanted her. And surprisingly, her donor also has low marrow cellularity. We did the bone marrow biopsy on the donor as well. And there are so-called idiopathic aplastic anemia in which we are unable to do the NGS studies. They do have the underlying genetic lesions, and some of the in one of our studies from our center, we detected certain novel genetic mutations in TERK and TERT, in addition to other mutations. And my assumption is that the underlying genetic predisposition or genetic lesions are not infrequent in our setup, and they predispose to development of aplasia. Though though they do not fit in any particular syndrome.
So hopefully once we have got in-house more detailed NGS studies, hopefully we'll be able to get those that information.
We should be able to characterize these cases.
So thank you, General Pervez. So we have got a comment from Dr. Humayun Shafiq Sethi, and he has just elaborated on that, just seconding what you have said, General Pervez, that out of 1,324 aplastic anemia cases, only 34 cases were associated with hepatitis. So it was a low number, around 2.5%. And that's being mentioned in the data from Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center as well. So I'll ask Dr. Humayun Shafiq on the same note regarding osteopetrosis. And the question is that, do you normally see any association in the context of families having osteopetrosis in Pakistan? Dr. Humayun Shafiq Sethi?
We have so far collected data from 22 osteopetrosis families, with some of them having multiple affected children. We are planning to streamline our pipeline for genetic screening for most frequently mutated genes, named DCIRG1 and CLCN7, which are otherwise mentioned elsewhere in the literature as well. So in all these 22 families were collected from OPD from Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center and KRL. These are only 2 centers, and you can see the huge number of data that we are collecting. It was merely an effort of 1 year. Even in the backdrop of pandemic, we are able to collect 22 families of osteopetrosis, infantile osteopetrosis I'm referring to. So I've requested all the hematologists in PSH group through the WhatsApp group, if they are able to identify some families to us, we'll be happy to help them with a genetic diagnosis.
That would be really good and amazing. So Dr. Humayun Shafiq Sethi, just one more question. Are any specific areas of Pakistan which have got more osteopetrosis, which you have come across or which you have observed in that data?
Actually, Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center has a patient clientele, which ranges from Central Punjab to NWFP or KP region. So we predominantly see patients from this area. I haven't yet got any families from Karachi. Rather, there was one Air Force officer whose family was previously being treated, whose daughter was previously treated at FBMTC, and then he moved to Karachi. Otherwise, I'm yet to get any family from the southern part of the country. Probably it's because of the catchment area.
Okay, and it will also depend on that how from there they actually origin, because sometimes the families do migrate as they go along as well during the course of life. Thank you, Dr. Humayun. Thanks a lot for that. So we'll move on to our panelists for now. And any comments and questions from our distinguished panelists?
Yes, I would like to ask General Pervez about what we have seen over the years, that the bone marrow cellularity in a normal person is also less in our population, and we have seen quite a few patients with normal blood counts and cellularity around 20, 25, 30%. So what are your comments about the normal cellularity in our population and how we define hypocellular marrow in Pakistan?
Difficult question. At one time, probably we thought of doing bone marrow defined biopsies on all the donors, just to assess the normal bone marrow cellularity in our population. I don't know whether we progressed on that project at APMTC or not. I'm not sure. But we had decided at one time that we should do the bone marrow biopsies on all cases at the time of marrow harvest so that we should ascertain our normal values. Probably that is the only way.
So we have collected almost all the donor marrows, and we are in a process of now randomizing them to different observers, and you may get few bone marrows to comment upon the cellularity so that we can determine the normal marrow cellularity of our population. But then again, these are the donors of the patients who are already affected by some bone marrow disease. But yes, these donors also, majority of these donors are from aplasia patients, because we have done more aplastic transplant than leukemia transplant. So I don't know whether they will be actually representative marrows, because they will be from the same family. As you have said that we have seen that this aplasia may run in family.
I think it's pertinent to divide it into two groups. The donors that are from the patients of aplasia families, and the other than aplastic anemia patients. I mean the donors coming from the thalassemia or the blood malignancies, and we can have the comparison between these two donor populations, whether they belong to the aplasia families or to other than aplasia families.
So I also just want to make a comment that as the General Pervez was saying, in the last couple of months, I've done 2-3 transplants in which aplastic anemias, and 2 out of these 3, the first donor has hypocellular marrow. Although he was patients were of acquired aplastic anemia, and the donor, one of the donor have mobilized. We primed him. He's mobilized, but on the final day, his counts dropped, and because we have no choice at that time, so the bone marrow was done, and that was hypocellular, and we achieved just 0.3 or 0.5 CD34 dose. But unluckily, he had a sister which was already matched, and we have rescued that patient with his sister with giving GCSF from day -0 and then mobilize it at day 5, peripheral stem cells. And the second donor again have a very hypocellular marrow. And so, as the General Pervez was saying, there is some familial pattern which has not been grouped as a Fanconi anemia or dyskeratosis congenita. But if you can do the NGS studies, you can pick up these patients, the families with having the features of acquired aplastic anemia, but they are familiar in their pathogenesis.
And maybe this is one of the reasons that we see very low response rate to immunosuppressive therapy in our population, and a relatively younger age group in which our aplasia patient present. So that it would be very interesting to see if Humayun Shafiq Satti can do something more in finding out what he has done in like osteopetrosis, and in these cases we can find out the familial pattern of this aplastic anemia.
Actually, Dr. Zainab is already endeavoring on a project that based on telomere length assay, establishing that at AFPMTC, probably doing a telomere length assay for prospective donors over the years. If we get some good quality data that might provide some baseline for our population, particularly in hyperplastic marrow patients and their families.
Thank you, Dr. Humayun. So I would ask Dr. Brigadier Asad Mahmood Abbasi as well. I think the same question that in our normal population, what's your experience in the context of cellularity? Because our other panelists are of the view that they have got a feeling that we are seeing hypoplasia even in normal or patients with no symptoms or people with no symptoms at all. So, sir, what's your kind of experience in this regard?
In cases of aplastic anemia, or
in general, so in general, when the marrow comes normally with different age groups, do you normally see them being more hypocellular if they are coming from other reasons, like for example lymphoma staging and so on, or do you normally see them normocellular? Like
it's rather not uncommon for us to encounter these patients with who come to us with pancytopenia and they have hypocellular marrow. Aplastic anemia per se is not very common in our setting, what we encounter here at AFIP. But otherwise, pancytopenia with other causes like megaloblastic anemia or B12 folate deficiency, Hep C, they are frequently we encounter them.
Okay, so now I've got another question to General Pervez, and the question is that in your experience when you're using bone marrow transplantation in spheroaplastic anemias, initially Dr. Sobia Umar, when she presented the use of immunosuppressive therapy in different stages or different intensities of aplastic anemia, almost 50% were spheroaplastic anemias. So is it like we do come across in Pakistan more spheroaplastic anemias, or do you think that it's because just a tertiary care referral center system that in your center, in the previous Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center, you are experiencing having more spheroaplastic anemias? So what's your kind of a feel on it?
The percentage of spheroaplasia is relatively more in our setup.
Okay. Okay.
Compared with the non-spheroaplastic anemia and the very spheroaplastic anemia, they not only they do not respond to the immunosuppressive therapy, but probably the other reason is that they do not have time to survive till we can see the effect of immunosuppressive therapy, and that is the reason, one of the reason that the results of immunosuppressive therapy are poor in very spheroaplastic anemia. But definitely the fraction of spheroaplasia is more that we see.
Okay. And then my other question is at the same note to Brigadier Kamran. And the question is that when you see non-spheroaplastic anemia, how often do you see that they transform into spheroaplastic anemia? What's your experience on that, sir?
What my experience is that generally the presentation of the patient is if it is mild or non-severe, then they do not usually progress if you put them on some immunosuppressive therapy. And in case of severe aplastic anemia, they may even improve with passage of time. Very severe aplastic anemia, they hardly survive beyond 3-4 months without any transplant or any definitive treatment. But mild or moderate aplastic anemia may linger on with this sort of anemia for years, and it's not very usual to see their status fluctuating from mild to moderate and moderate to severe. It's not very usual. I have no definite data about that the cohort which is followed for a certain period of time and then their cellularity is serially assessed and their counts are serially followed. But this is what my general perception is, that I think General Pervez would be a better person to answer this question.
I actually do not remember the exact percentages. Maybe Humayun, if he is online, he has got access to data on his mobile that what particular percentage of our cases were very severe and non-severe aplastic anemia. We have got the data, and we have got the longitudinal follow-up for almost 2 decades on aplastic anemia, including their transformation into PNH, MDS, and acute leukemia. But I do not exactly remember the percentages.
They do not very frequently they do not very frequently transform into a severe from aplasia, but it's not unusual to see an aplastic anemia transforming to MDS and then on to AML.
I also just want to make one comment regarding the non-severe aplastic anemia. My experience is that, especially while I was in Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center, and now also, I always see the bone marrow of that patient of aplastic anemia, whether he coming to the clinic or wherever. And it is my observation that we are not focusing, not even in the books, been labeled as the severity of aplastic anemia with morphology or the bone marrow cellularity. It is basically based on peripheral parameters, the neutrophil counts and platelet count and so on and so forth. But if you are focusing with, especially as a morphologist, the hypercellularity of the bone marrow, if it is less than 10%, even if the patient is non-severe, it is my observation that these are the patients who usually either improve, or if they are not improving, they will land into severe and very severe aplastic anemia. Especially if and it is very commonly you have seen that the reports, they are ignored that the cellularity is 5%. But because the parameters are stable, the neutrophils is good enough, then they are labeled as non-severe. And these are actually the patients, if you focus with the bone marrow, the morphology with the less than 5% or 5 to 10% cellularity, they are the patients who are initially maybe in the non-severe form. They usually go into severe and very severe aplastic anemia, and their response is also variable. And especially when you give immunosuppressive like cyclosporine or eltromopag or so on and so forth, either they improve or they will very rapidly deteriorate. And the third thing with my observation is that the severe form of aplastic anemia in the younger people, less than 20, is more rapidly deteriorates, some or the other. And that can be correlated with some genetic predisposition, which we are still not picking up as the cause of aplastic anemia in our setup.
So thank you. Now we've got a question from one of our question is to Dr. General Parvez, and it's from Dr. Mohammad Sajid Yazdani, and he's asked about some comments about post-COVID pancytopenia. So the question is to Dr. General Parvez. So your experience in the context of a pancytopenia related to COVID, have you experienced any kind of patients in that regard?
I have not come across much cases of COVID because that doesn't come in my domain. But in our hospital, we have seen a couple of cases, though presenting with moderate pancytopenia, not a very severe or severe pancytopenia. Moderate cytopenia is commonly associated with COVID, but Dr. Raheel Iftikhar has got study on the hematological findings in COVID. It's a large cohort, more than 500 cases, and I think it would be pertinent to direct this question to Dr. Raheel in case he is available.
Can I also make a comment? Just one comment regarding COVID infection, because I'm working in Shifa, and there are so many cases of COVID coming, and they are referring to the hematologist for consultation. And I've done a small study, I would say, around about 10 to 15 cases in which the bone marrow was done, especially in those patients of COVID infection which have a progressive course and going downward. And would you believe that all of them have, out of those 10, because I've selected, it's because already the patient is very serious, so the bone marrow biopsy is not done so easily. But in all of them, hemophagocytosis, HLH, all have presented with HLH, all have that is a part of disease also, but they have hyperferritinemia, hypertriglyceridemia with hemophagocytosis, and of course pancytopenia. And so this may be one of the cause of HLH post-COVID. And I think out of 10, 9 have died.
Oh. And did they die of pancytopenia, Janal or did they die of the COVID itself?
It is not sure what it is, but because they have a very severe pancytopenia, and you can't give them those sort of therapies which is required, like a toposide or steroids or methylprednisolone and dexamethasone. So because they are already have having chest symptoms and all that. So, although it is well known that viral infections are well known, one of the cause of HLH, other secondary cause of HLH. So this may be because it's a new disease. So this study can be added that one of the important cause of HLH is COVID infections in future. But this is my own study which I am still doing it. And because they are very serious patients, the attendants, the family is not ready for bone marrow biopsy. But up till now, 9-10 have done it, and all of them have this problem.
Okay, thank you, Janal Sati. So I've got a question to Brigadier Asad Mahmood Abbasi, and the question is in the context of COVID again. So your experience, sir, in the context of abnormal CBC or abnormal cytopenias in COVID era, have you seen more patients or more people having cytopenias in this regard, and what's your experience in this?
Actually, we are here at FIP where we are dealing with patients from CMH. That is the hospital which doesn't deal with COVID patients. It's the MH, military hospital, which deal with the COVID patients. However, a small percentage of patients, COVID patients that CBC came over here, and most of them had pancytopenia.
Okay, and so I think we'll get Dr. Brigadier Kamran's views there as well, as he's there in Armed Forces Bone Marrow Transplant Center at the moment. Sir, your comments on that, sir?
COVID-associated aplasia. I think Dr. Ahil Iftikhar is the pertinent person. I'll hand him over. He can comment on aplasia following COVID. He has got collection of a lot of cases.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming up.
Honored.
And please enlighten us in the context. So it's a COVID-related cytopenias. That's the question from one of our participants, and some distinguished panelists have already commented on that. We'll get your review as well, as you have done some studies in it recently.
Interestingly, actually, we have seen monocytopenia, bicytopenia, and pancytopenia in patients with COVID, and the etiologies have been different. It is starting from simple thrombocytopenia, which is due to CRS, drug-induced, then bicytopenia due to HLH, bicytopenia due to triggering of TMAs, which we frequently seen that complement-mediated TTP is very common in patients with COVID. And then pancytopenia, just like any other viral infection, which can lead to post-infectious aplastic anemia. Prolonged pancytopenias and aplastic anemia are seen in COVID patients. So we have got a data of around 549 patients which were admitted with severe to critical COVID, and cytopenias were seen in around 38% of the patients, and pancytopenia was there in around 5% of the patients, and the severity of cytopenias directly correlate with the outcome, and the more were the cytopenias and lineage involvement, poor was the outcome.
Okay, I mean that's very informative. Thank you. I'll just share my experience with one of our patients who presented to us with red cell aplasia, and she had COVID as well around 6-7 months ago, and since then she was having progressive anemia. So all other lineages were normal, but red cell aplasia was there in bone marrow with anemia, and she has recovered spontaneously. But is your experience in that as well, sir? Anything you have experience in the context of just single lineage red cells being involved?
Yes, I can remember two patients which we saw during there was a call. So both of them had pure red cell aplasia. One of them I remember the patient recovered. Second patient, I don't think I followed him up, but there were two patients of pure red cell aplasia.
Okay. Okay, so thank you. That's very kind. So now we will be concluding our session. So thank you to all the panelists and to Dr. Raheel as well for coming up and giving us some information on COVID-19 related cytopenias. So thank you to all the participants as well for attending this session. Thank you, Ji, and Allah Hafiz.